What's up, fellow gamers? Phreak here. I'm the design lead of Summoner's Rift Team's live pod, here to talk about some changes coming in a patch 14.5. Of course, point 4 just went live yesterday, so there's going to be 2 weeks away, but there are some pretty big updates to talk about, which is the RekSai kit update that landed yesterday, and the Seraphine update that is coming next patch, unless something stops us from shipping it, which is possible, though unlikely. So we're going to talk about RekSai first, and then talk about Seraphine. If you're only here for Seraphine, you can skip forward in the video until you see her name on the screen, but let's talk about how RekSai has landed so far. Ultimately, RekSai is weak. We thought these changes were going to be win rate positive. Of course, we were wrong. Once again, this is a team collaboration. As a team, we thought this was going to be power positive. It was not, and so of course we're going to buff her. She's got a lot of room for buffs, and so there's a lot of room to give her more power, and so we'll think about what she needs. We've got a couple of days to plan that out. No big problem. Additionally, there are some bugs, some that either weren't fully fixed, some that we knew we were shipping because we saw the bug too late on PBE and we never found it internally, and so let's talk about it. So first up, there is an intentional, I guess you'll say, nerf in the RekSai update that is live today, which is that you can cancel your Q auto attacks. And because Q is an auto attack I've explained this bug several times, but I'll explain it here anyway, which is that because Q was an uncancelable auto attack, you are allowed to cast instant cast spells during that window. But the way RekSai's R is scripted, it is an instant cast spell that then casts a real spell, and that real spell is what burrows her underground and then launches at her target. So the first part, which put it on cooldown, is what was sending the call to cast a spell that couldn't be cast because Q as an auto attack was uncancelable. For reference, you cannot cast a normal spell or an instant cast spell while casting another spell. It's only uncancelable auto attacks that have this unique behavior here. So ultimately, it was too late to rescript the R. This ended up being a very, very easy change, but due to wanting to give QA time, I again, didn't want to slip it into the patch last minute, and so her Q is cancelable for the next 2 weeks. The change ends up making the wrapper a very, very, very short, unfeelable cast time, and then putting the logic loop at the end of the cast time, but because the spell is no longer instant cast, you can't cast it while using empowered auto attacks, and we can put the empowered auto attack back to uncancelable. This ended up being an easy fix. If we had caught it sooner, we could have put it into the patch. It's our bad for not catching it, but ultimately, that's going to be happening here. Many instances of the quote-unquote tunnel bug, which is where you would cast burrowed E and then not go anywhere, I believe many of these cases were fixed in the patch, though they still exist some, I just believe to a lower frequency. This is looking at people giving reports from PBE where they couldn't repro tunnel bug anymore in the 14.4 PBE, so that was cool, but there are still some instances. The tough thing about fixing a bug like this is you can't prove a negative. Ultimately, I've looked at the script of the ability, and it just basically sets one distance or one location and says, put the tunnel there, and then dash me there. I do have a speculative fix for the last few times this will happen in 14.5. In 14.4, I cleaned up a lot of the scripting to make sure that was actually what the logic was saying at that point. I think the tunnel bug is happening less, but I believe it's still happening some. I mean, I know it's still happening some on live. And after putting in my speculative fixes, I could not locally reproduce tunnel bug anymore. And I could get it like once in every 20 tunnels, and now I can't. Not to say that it's definitely gone. Again, you can't prove a negative here, but especially so when it's an unlikely repro. But I believe, hopefully in 0.5, there will no longer be any bugs with the dash. That is hopeful. There is a bug where if you unburrow by trying to auto attack, in some cases, the game can get in a weird state where your champion will no longer auto attack, and you have to press Q or send some other commands to get your auto attack back. That is fixed in 14.5. It's a little rare to do so to get in the state, but of course it does exist. It sucks when it happens, so that's a bug that is getting fixed as well. And then also Spear of Shojin stacking on her Q. If her Q, melee Q, the auto attacks only hit a primary target. This is now fixed, so Spear of Shojin will now work sort of perfectly here with RekSai moving forward. Okay, great. Of course, there is room to buff RekSai. RekSai probably has room for 2.5 to 3% of win rate growth. I don't think just these bug fixes are going to give us that. But I also got to spend some time digging into a lot of the files, more of the files around RekSai, and I learned more about how our animation tech works and how attacks and spells are built even farther under the hood than simply scripting them. And so I learned some stuff today. I put in a bunch of tweaks here that should feel very, very good. And so there's more quality of life / buffs here. I still don't think we're at 3% win rate of all this stuff, but here's what's going on right now. So I learned about how some animations work. Generally speaking, Individual spell animations are built usually on a 60 frame cadence. That's just how the animator builds it. They have 60 keyframes, and there's generally rules of thumb around when an auto attack is supposed to land and whatnot, whatever. The full thing from starting to rear back into fully recovering back to idle is 60 frames of animation. This is not how long your actual auto attack lasts. If you want to right click to get away from auto attack animation, you can do so very quickly on. But technically, the entire file for an animation of any basic attack or any spell is almost always 60 frames. Okay, great. There's another thing called cast frames. So there are two ways you can essentially define how quickly a spell animates under the hood. There's the old way and the new way. I will describe the new way. So the new way to do it when you're using auto attack specifically is you say, hey, the entire time, quote unquote time, is 1 over my base attack speed. In the case of Rek'Sai, who has a 0.667 base attack speed, this time is 1.5 seconds, right? If you are a level 1 champion with no bonus stats, your entire auto attack cycle takes 1.5 seconds. That is how long the cycle lasts, and then you can basically ascribe everything to a factor of that number. Anyway, all this to say that another way of looking at this is to say, okay, we know the total time to go from, 0.1 to 0.2 using an entire auto attack loop is 1.5 seconds. We also are going to define your auto attack spell as taking a quarter second to cast. We can put that at whatever we want because that is not the breakpoint at which the actual damage occurs, but it is a way to essentially speed up the entire animation to say that, well, we want this entire thing to take a quarter second, half a second, who cares? You pick a number, right? You say how long you want the actual thing to last, how long you want the entire animation to play out for if you were to take your hands off the keyboard and move it. And for modern champions, this tends to be a quarter of a second, that your entire loop takes a quarter of a second. Okay, great. That's fine. If you were to, for example, look up the League Wiki and you look at it's their attack speed breakpoint or something. I forget what it's actually called in the wiki. But that is functionally doing the math there, right? 0.25 versus the attack loop timer. And you'll see 20% or 17% or 26%. In the case of RekSai is around 27%. And that is a very slow loop. That is a very slow animation relative to more or less everything else about her kit. For reference, when we updated mage kits to bring them to a new floor, we brought them to 20%. That was the animation speed of 20%, and in this case, lower is better. At 1%, there basically is no animation. So there are some cast frames. Another thing that exists is an attack timer. I'm backwards here, by the way. What I just talked about is the attack timer. I'm now going to talk about cast frames, but whatever. So the other thing that exists under the hood is at which frame in the animation are you actually casting your spell? The vast majority of spells and attacks in League of Legends have wind down times built into them. If you were to cast almost any spell built in the last 7 years or any attack built in the last forever, and you take your hands off your keyboard, you'll play a long animation, including recovering, but the actual projectile comes out of Andy's hand, or your actual claw strikes and deals damage to your opponent at a bespoke frame in the animation. And what I talked about earlier is the animation is 60 frames long. We define which frame of that animation does the spell cast, which is why cast frame was supposed to be here, but again, I got it out of order. So RekSai, in her 60 frame animation, the way she's hooked up right now is frame 12 is for her auto attacks and her Q when her strike actually hits. I have not checked every other auto attacker in the game. I don't know what everyone else's attack frame is, but it feels slow to me when I look at the actual animation of the spells and I look at it frame by frame and say, when should she be making contact with her opponent? Right now, this is moving her basic attack from frame 12 to frame 10. That is a 20% faster rate, of course, of functionally. Right, this by itself won't change the speed of the animation. This will change when in the animation the strike is actually happening. That has been sped up by 2 frames, which is pretty meaningful. Again, 20% faster. For her Q auto attacks is being sped up from, I believe it's from 12 to 9. The one weird thing about RekSai is She has different enough animations for her Q across her various skins that there are some pretty severe constraints around what actually looks okay. And so, like, there are some skins where you could have gone to 7 frames to look okay, and it would look completely unreasonable on others. And there's some where 10 frames is kind of reasonable, or 12 frames is kind of reasonable, but like 12 looks way too late on others. And so 9 was a middle ground where all skins looked reasonable. It is still faster than her basic attack. Her basic attack, of course, gives her Q, like, literally gives attack speed, which speeds up the animation as well. And ultimately, not only is what's going to happen to RekSai is not only is the hit going to occur sooner in the animation itself, but the animation itself is also going to be faster because I've shortened the attack timers. So this will do an extremely large amount to making RekSai's auto attacks feel better, to give her a lot more room for orb walking and kiting. And with the Q cancel getting sort of re-added as an uncancelable auto attack, you're going to have a lot more freedom to move between attacks. I don't believe, again, that all this sums up to 3% win rate to RekSai, but this is a very good first step to make her feel a lot better. And again, as mentioned, and then we'll buff her by whatever amount we think makes sense afterwards. But all these changes have been submitted today. We'll see if they all pass through QA. If so, then we're going to figure out what people think the win rate impact is and then give her whatever buffs are necessary. That's RekSai, basically. Obviously, I guess the last couple things I'll say is there, of course, has been really, really big interest in playing her. Of course, she does have some bugs. She is very, very weak right now, and so this is a champion that we will give some love to in the next patch, but people were definitely interested in playing out the new kit, which is great, and in a patch we'll shape her up and shore up her weaknesses in the ways that they're supposed to be, and hopefully we'll be in a good spot. So, okay. Now, let's talk about the second kit update in about 3 months to Seraphine. So first of all, why is there another set of Seraphine changes? Well, there are some problems that exist on current League of Legends. 2/3 of Seraphine's audience is still in support. And this is not just players, human beings, but actual games spent playing Seraphine. So her primary audience is still primarily support. One of the statements I have seen said is something to the effect of, well, actually her dedicated player base or something are actually AD carry or bot lane mains. I don't think there's proof for that. The evidence I see is that high elo players like to win the game, and bot lane Seraphine is so powerful that it's obviously correct to just play bot lane Seraphine if you want to win games of League of Legends. That's where I think a lot of her high elo pick rate is. Not because there's secretly this huge cabal of very dedicated, not that there aren't some, dedicated Seraphine bot lane players, but because she's really overpowered there, so she's getting a bunch of players because she's overpowered there. Anyway, her primary audience, this is irrefutable, her primary audience is in support. Her audience in mid lane does not really exist. The theory I'm going to put forth is that there is an audience for carry Seraphine, and I am down to support that audience. That audience is smaller than support Seraphine, but that audience is worth supporting. However, that audience will just play Seraphine in the bot lane. This is a champion with supportive aspects on her kit, who directly scale with nearby teammates. There is basically no world in which bot lane Seraphine is not better than mid lane Seraphine. This is irreconcilable. Okay, bot lane Seraphine will always be stronger than mid lane Seraphine, and if you want to play carry Seraphine, you will play her in bot lane, or you can play her in mid and she'll just be weaker there, and that's okay. But mid lane Seraphine AP carry win rate is not a primary consideration. But again, to be clear, Seraphine bot and Seraphine support are both primary considerations. So Seraphine support is trash, Seraphine bot is overpowered, and we have to reconcile a 6% win rate delta. That is really, 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 really large. This is why this work has to exist. Because a 6% win rate delta between her most common 2 roles, and both are relatively popular, is a very big deal and needs to be fixed. Additionally, there is room to make Seraphine a more fun champion to play. Some can be straight power, some can be kit reshapes, and so let's do all this. Let's make this a win all around, right? Alrighty, so what are the goals for this update? Well, the goals are to reconcile this 6% win rate delta into something palatable. To me, palatable is 49 to 50 at support, and 51 to 52 in bot lane is acceptable. I believe that bot Seraphine, if she is like literally exactly balanced, probably should rest above 50% win rate as a bot lane APC. Looking at her primary teammates, her most common compositions, a full 1/4 of her games are with Senna support. Senna likes playing with AP champs that you can't just build steel caps and hard counter the entire lane. Also, Senna has enough light CC that Seraphine combos with it pretty well. In general, also, Seraphine's primary comps that she's in typically are very light on crowd control overall. These are champions like Yone mid and Graves jungle and like Aatrox top, where she's the only magic damage dealer on the team. It's a bunch of melee champions whom she wants to ulti through. These are all fairly synergistic, and though I don't have a good rubric for exactly how much win rate inflation that actually is, my instinct is 51% or so. Seraphine is a more than reasonable win rate for her, and maybe she could be a little bit higher. Again, 51, 52 is acceptable, but 53.5 is clearly too high. So the goals are to bring bot lane Seraphine into, low orbit on Earth and not, on the moon, and bring support Seraphine up from the depths of the garbage dump into reasonably playable. If we can do better than this and close the gap to 50 and 51.5, awesome. Right? Again, I think Seraphine bot lane can deserve an above 50% win rate, and that's okay. Additionally, the goals are to make Seraphine more fun to play. Basically, Seraphine bot lane obviously always maxes Q. There's no way around that. She is a functionally primary mage, and she maxes her primary damage tool. Great. But about 3/4 of the players max shield, largely because it's correct, but about 1/4 of players max E because they want to play as a primary mage. And so let's bring them closer together. Let's actually lean mage first here, and let's close the gap on QE versus QW. Ideally, I think QE max should be best, but honestly, if they are close together, that's fine. Go ahead and choose your playstyle. But QW Seraphine is very overpowered. QE Seraphine is a little overpowered, and so need to close that down a little bit. Secondarily, what's interesting is, so for bot lane Seraphine, there are really only 2 skill builds. Seriously, like 1.2% of total players do anything but QE or QW max. Meanwhile, support Seraphine has like 6 skill orders with at least a 5% pick rate. And the thing is, if you don't have all the numbers memorized, any single combination of skill orders can make sense on support Seraphine. If you're playing support Seraphine to be a primary mage in the way that you play Lux or Karma or Brand or Zyra, QE makes sense. If you're playing her to be a crowd control shield support, a little bit like what Lulu does, a little bit like what Renata does, EW or WE makes sense. If you're playing her the way that you play bot Seraphine, which is like, well, Q and W are the best skills, QW makes sense. If you're playing her as a primary enchanter, W into whatever can make sense. And if you actually know what her strongest skills are, WQ is in fact her best skill order, but most Seraphines don't do it. But regardless, every single one of those skill ranks has a logical reason to do it, because each of those outputs can very clearly be the kind of thing a support player would want to do. And so the goal here is, I think we can pretty easily open all of those up. To say actually any skill order is viable, because any skill order is intellectually logical. If you compare to Twitch maxing W, that's not what Twitch is about. He's going to max Q or E. Those are the types of skills that make the most sense on him. We're not trying to support W max Twitch being a thing, as a random example out of nowhere. Tristana is probably never going to have max rocket jump be the primary skill order. This doesn't make sense. Same for Corki and Valkyrie, right? There's some skills where no, we're not going to support this. We don't need this to be correct or good, and no one's going to think that it's correct or good, and that's fine. But in the case of Seraphine, every skill order makes sense for a champion whose primary goal is not last hitting. And again, I think we can land this. So these are the goals of what we want to get out of the Seraphine update, okay? And again, generically more powerful because support Seraphine sucks. Okay. Tactics, right? Broadly speaking, what kinds of things are we going to do to make those things true? One is a very simple, very basic reshape to push her mana toward regen stats in a way from the flat pool. Now, mathematically, if you stay on the map for 4 minutes at a time, which is roughly the time to fight for dragon, reset, stay on the map, and then fight for dragon, or conversely, reset before dragon, fight for dragon, stay on the map, stay on the map, stay on the map, reset, fight for dragon. Not everyone takes 4 minutes to stay on the map, of course, but in general, if you do, this is relatively power neutral to how much mana she will have over the course of those 4 minutes if you don't have a support item. If you don't go Staff of Flowing Water, if you don't have your Zazax or Dreammaker or whatever. This will be the same amount of mana over the course of 4 minutes. Just the numbers are basically flat. Of course, if you do have support mana items, you're going to have more mana regen than before because your mana regen is up, your mana pool is down. Now, granted, many supports might not stay on the map for a full 4 minutes. They will have to restock for rewards a bit sooner, but also people don't always recall on perfect timing, and I think it's going to be relatively close. It's relatively close, TLDR. We can give some mana back if we need to because it's not. That's fine. Ultimately, playtesting and feels around mana pool will dictate what we kind of need to do to our mana pool, but that's roughly where we are numbers-wise. The second broad tactic is basically PvP power up and PvE power down. This is partially a way to give power to support Seraphine that does not directly power up bot lane Seraphine, because support Seraphine doesn't need a last hit. In fact, a lot of times support Seraphine steals last hits away from her teammates because her Q will execute and crush minion kills, and right, that's obviously a fair bit of power. So it's, PvP power up in very direct ways to make her better at killing, better at fragging enemy champions, but her ability to kill minions is going down. One of the things that is currently true about the currently overpowered bot lane AP carry Seraphine is that she is an extremely strong wave clear bot, where very quickly, around rank 3 Q, she one-shots half the minion wave with double cast Q. She sets it up very easily with her E, and essentially it is incredibly low interaction to play with Seraphine and playing against Seraphine in bot lane. You can leave her alone, she'll wave clear forever, she might drop CS once in a while if you try to zone her off, but her ranges are pretty long, her damage is very high, it's very easy for her to get a lot of last hits. She just have to play up on the wave almost at all. There are some very, very significant cuts to her ability to kill minions without help or without dedicating more resource to this. Again, we do need to take power out of bot lane Seraphine. There are some direct buffs to the champions. There are very significant PvE nerfs to this champion in this patch. But more than just mana reshape, more than just some PvP power, we're giving some generic power to the champion as well. Just overall, generically, here's some win rate. Again, has to be compensated in bot lane APC, but, helps support Seraphine no problem. And then again, as mentioned here with support, tighten the skill max differences so that you can more readily pick whichever skill order you think makes sense for you. Okay, so these are the kinds of things we are doing in order to bridge the gap between these champions to make AP carry Seraphine feel better. As a core AP user, we're actually going to build like Seraphs and Roa, and maybe you add Leandries or you go Deathcap or something, and you're more of a primary damage champion. Okay, so now let's finally get into the individual changes themselves and what they are doing. So first, a big suite of changes to the Q. Missile speed is being increased from, I believe it's 1200 to 1300. A lot of what I do when I make sort of live changes to champions is I compare them to other similar characters who feel fair. So currently, the missile speed of Seraphine Q is technically identical to that of Lux E, except that Lux E explosion is instantaneous and Seraphine Q has to bloom out. The radius is larger, sure, which makes it better against minions, by the way, but because the explosion takes longer, this thing is skewed toward minions and away from damaging champions. Did not change the bloom speed, did not change the bloom radius, but did increase the missile speed to say it's a little bit more reliable as a poke tool. It's not going to be quite as good as not Light Binding, but Lucid Singularity, but it's going to be relatively close. So, okay, cool, you have as good of poke as Lux E. Okay, fine. Now, commensurate with that is a mana cost that is more like Lux E. Lux E costs 70 to 110 mana. That is very, very high. And yet somehow Lux is a completely viable champion as a farm role with a very expensive farm tool that she has to then follow up with basic attacks and last hitting and whatnot. And again, she is a totally viable mid laner as a result. So I think Seraphine can stomach this. There is also a base damage increase on the Q. A lot of what's happening here, as well as the damage amp, is getting increased from 150% to 160%. A lot of the logic here is to say that this is an ability that by raising the max power of the spell, you are more likely to decide to choose to empower the Q. Right now, it is clearly correct to always double cast your W for the heal, for the double shield, for all the movement speed. It's clearly correct to double cast your W in almost all cases. The more I can give power to a max rank Q or a max rank E, the more I can bribe Seraphine into double casting one of the other spells instead, and thus being a primary mage. And so the damage amp going up, the ultimate base damage going up, which will then multiply against the damage amp, means that you'll have substantially more damage on a low health enemy champion to then kill them, to then say it's worth it to cast Q, because I'm going to burn this cooldown, I'm going to deal really, really meaningful damage. And what this means is a double cast low health Q has something like 500 total damage before the AP ratio. And the total AP ratio is going to be something like 160%, I want to say. I think it's an 80% AP ratio if it's fully maximized per cast, which you can double cast. That is a lot of damage, right? That is the kind of ability that absolutely kills champions, and trying to play up the fact that a lot of your power is in being a mage. Damage is up, damage amp is up, and missile speed is up. That is a lot. That said, though, in order to try to collapse the regular incentives, the Q cooldown incentive is going from 1 second per rank, 9 to 5, to half a second per rank, 8 to 6. This is why I'm allowed to buy extra max damage via the amp and the base damage and the missile speed, right? This skill now deals more damage flat out, so you get fewer casts of them. Now, the total DPS of Q itself is going to be, generally speaking, higher here. But if you do choose to 1.1 your Q, you still get the full AP ratio, you still get a decent amount of the base damage, and you actually get some of the cooldown for free. To say that you can play WE Seraphine and still have a pretty good Q. Or EW Seraphine, or whatever. Again, mana tweaks are also there to slightly disincentivize or bridge the gap between Qmax and not Qmax, because Qmax is almost always optimal. It's still going to be true, again, for botlane Seraphine, but that's okay. Tweaks now to the W. Right now, the shield is getting a flat plus 10. This is meant to be early game skewed. The difficulty with Seraphine W is that it probably has a few, well, maybe like one too many mechanic on it, but I'm not ripping any mechanics off. But Seraphine W is a large radius, no fall off AoE shield with a very meaningful amount of bonus move speed attached to it as well. That's a very, very, very strong skill when you're buffing 3 to 4 champs in a team fight. It's Sona E plus Sona W. It's basically Karma Mantra E, but on I think it's 28 to 14, I think is the cooldown right now. It's very, very strong and honestly relatively short. But in lane, a base shield of 50, when the move speed is not that useful because you're using it to like block a Draven Q or a Zyra Q or something, this spell feels like it kind of sucks. And so it is a 10 flat shield increase. It is also a significant decrease to the level 1 cooldown on the spell, but a nerf to the rank 5 cooldown on the spell, because it's very, very obvious that you should max W first in support and second as AP carry. And so by heavily going after the cooldown incentive from 3 seconds per rank to 1 second per rank, this heavily nerfs the cooldown incentive. We're also overall decreasing the power of W via the AP ratio on the move speed. This still gives you the 20% to yourself. It still gives you the 8% to your allies. But the AP ratio here is being cut in half. Again, the AP ratio is functionally buffed via the Q, via the damage amp. It's getting buffed in the E. We'll talk about that later. But it's saying that if you are playing AP Seraphine, you're maybe not stacking haste, and you've got a lot of ability power, but not your stats. You're not going to bump your W very much, either the shield value or the move speed value. You're going to bump your Q, you're going to bump your damage. That's what you're going to get out of that, and that's going to be what's happening here. There was also a cost buff, again, talking about how in lane, it can sometimes feel like a trap to press rank 1 W. So a 10 mana cost buff on Q, a 10 shield buff on Q. There's also a, I think it's a 6 second cooldown buff on rank 1 Q. There's a lot of power going into rank 1 W. Sorry, I'm saying Q. Rank 1 W here in all these cases, except for the AP ratio. So if you are playing QE Seraphine, strict buff, and strict buff here is a lot for QE Seraphine. We'll get to the nerfs later. There are some, but that's what's happening right here. This is the only nerf for W if you're playing QE Seraphine. We then move down to the E changes. E is getting a 15% AP ratio increase. One thing that I'm keeping in the back of my head is trying to, once again, maintain the parity of Q versus E versus W in terms of what you choose to double cast. And one of the tough things here is the fact that these cooldowns are not the same. So in the case that if Q is a short cooldown spell, is it as strong per cast as E, or is it as strong per cooldown as E? Because if it's as strong per like second of cooldown, then of course you should always double cast W or always double cast E, because those are just stronger per button press. You should always double cast the stronger buttons. One thing I've tried very hard to adhere to is ensuring that for damage, Q always beats E. Some of this is the amp. Some of this is maintaining that the Q AP ratio is at least as good as the E AP ratio, at least under any amount of actual damage amp here. But the AP ratio is going up to good. The AP ratio on E is now going to be pretty good. It's not going to be amazing, but it's certainly not going to be garbage like it is right now, so that E is actually a meaningful damage skill, so that Q and E are meaningful throughputs here. E is now getting cooldown scaling on the rank up. It is basically always correct to max E last, no matter your champion, role, or build. Okay, you're always Seraphine, but no matter your role or build, it is always correct to max E last, and so I'm swinging very, very hard on making maxing E better. The cooldown is now going to scale with rank. The CC duration is now going to scale with rank. The cost is no longer going to scale up with rank, and the damage is being tweaked a little bit. This is actually a little bit less damage per rank up. The reason being that this is now a base damage of 10 to 30 flat more than Q, so that you don't have these weird aberrations where like once you hit max rank E, it now deals more damage than most amped Q casts would be. It's just a way to try to ensure that this doesn't get out of line, because of course it will also apply a slow, it'll also do whatever else, and so just trying to keep this in mind, trying to keep this in line, but with a cooldown buff at max rank, with a CC duration buff at max rank, it's clearly still a better rank ability than before, plus the AP ratio making it better on AP builds, which that then also multiplies with the ability power, multiplies with the cooldown going down, and should overall be a stronger ability if you're able to put points into it. Now, if you are leaving E as a 1-point wonder, aka you're playing QW, well, you're getting nerfed. You're getting an AP ratio buff, but you're getting a worse cooldown, you're getting worse CC duration, you're getting the same cost. You are getting a little bit more base damage, a little bit more AP ratio, but those are getting countered by the CD being longer, so are you really getting that much more in sort of total throughput? And so again, trying to deprioritize WMAX, because WMAX is so obviously correct, second as APC and first at support. There are some very, very light changes to R. There is an AP ratio nerf on R. This is not so much meant to be a really, really big nerf to Seraphine specifically. It's more my own proclivities around, I don't think ults should scale that heavily with investment. They are meant to have a very good amount of baseline value, so that even if you are having a bad game, your ult can always turn the game around. I would always rather take an ultimate and buff the base and nerf the ratio in most cases. I guess I shouldn't say always, right? Because it's not always going to be true here. But in general, that is something that I'm trying to nudge the game towards, because I believe it makes sense for the game, that even if you're getting completely screwed, a long cooldown effective ultimate can always turn the tides, but it's got to be skillful to use it. And, if you manage your cooldowns well and you manage your skill shots well, you get a way of trying to get around. So I'm just trying to lock less of the ult power behind AP ratio and give it to things that are more repeatable that you will actually appreciate. If you're snowballing, you more than make up for this AP ratio nerf in the R in the E straight up. There is a nerf for the cooldown of R at level 11 and 16. This is directly meant to be a AP carry nerf more than a support nerf. A lot of supports will take 20 minutes or so to get level 11. It does not take that much time for a bot laner, and so this will also nerf, I guess, mid lane Seraphine, because mid lane Seraphine can actually reach 16. But either way, again, the entire point is just, it is a very, very light touch. Just one more small little lever we can use to say, hey, AP carry Seraphine, be a little bit weaker. I also think this ultimate is so powerful. It deserves to have one of the longest cooldowns in the game, because this thing can be a full enemy team 1.75 second better than hard CC, because they actually walk at your team to make the rest of your skill shots easier to land. Like, this is, I think, probably this actually might be the strongest teamfight ult in the game. It's certainly top 10%. This spell having one of the longest cooldowns in the game is more than reasonable for the power of this ability, straight up. But yes, these are just direct nerfs. R is becoming a weaker spell, full stop. This is just true. This is one of the nerfs on the change here. Then there are some miscellaneous changes, including to the passive and base stats. There is a damage reshape to the passive. This is almost always strictly buffed until level 16 plus. The AP ratio is a little bit weaker, so some builds will have less passive damage, but keep in mind that level 16 does not exist on supports. So except for exactly level 13 and 14, support Seraphine literally always has more base damage. And the theory I hold is that support Seraphine has a lot more license to use notes to deal bonus damage, and certainly in a team fight, it's not hard for AP carry Seraphine to go right-click people. Absolutely, totally going to be possible, and it's going to happen in every team fight. And hey, by the way, in the early game, when you group at level 6 for a dragon fight or whatever, or you go fight for Herald or whatever at level 8 or whatever, you are absolutely going to have more note damage here, and you'll be a contributor via using your passive. Like, this will be stronger for all early game fights. Eventually, super late game, notes will be less powerful, but like, it still has a decent AP ratio, all things considered, in terms of total throughput of, hits per cast and whatnot, because you're getting it, off of all your teammates and whatnot. You're getting a bunch of bonus range. It's giving you a lot of target access here. Ultra late game, again, it's weaker with high ends of ability power or level 16 plus, but on average, power positive with the passive as a chain is meant to be more of a buff to support than a buff to bot lane. As mentioned, there's mana tweaks here, mana regen in for mana growth. The numbers might be wrong. Happy to tweak them overall, but right now they're pegged to 4 minutes, or I think it's actually 3 minutes to regen as much mana as you would get from the pool otherwise. She's getting 5 base MS. This is the kind of thing that 330, which is what she's going to, is the baseline move speed of a ranged champion. This is like the normal number. Some champs are meant to be slower because they're either already highly mobile out of combat, or they have very, very good evasive tools already, so their on-foot speed needs to be low. In the case of Sona, as an example, Sona's E has almost 100% uptime if she's casting it while walking out of base. So her out-of-combat move speed is always 325 plus 11 or so % from AP ratio. Seraphine's W is not nearly as good for self-move speed, at least duration-wise and cooldown-wise especially, as Sona E. Her in-combat move speed is a little bit nicer, sure, because she's going to get that burst with a W, but okay, she has some decent move speed tools. That's not enough to be bottom-of-the-barrel move speed, so 330 feels reasonable here. Also, supports tend to roam more than bot laners, so this is the kind of buff that will affect support more than affects bot lane, though of course will feel nice for bot lane. This is a lot of buff right now, right? If you're playing, so currently right now, AP QE Seraphine in bot lane is still an overtuned champion and is more powerful than she deserves to be. If you look at these changes and say, okay, well, my Q has more missile speed, more base damage, more damage amp, I will kind of feel a 1 second cooldown nerf, I will kind of feel a mana cost change, rank 1 W, strictly more powerful, small nerf here, strictly more powerful, Emax after level 10, well, AP ratio always better, cooldown level 10 plus always better, level 10 plus always better, level 8 plus always better, damage tweaks literally better at rank 1, and then eventually I break even at level 10, and then, oh no, it's worse at, level 12, AP ratio takes over, right? It's like, oh, we're buffing an already overpowered QE max Seraphine. There must be nerfs, and there are, right? So let's talk about the nerfs, because that's a lot of power. Let's bring it down, because there needs to be some. We are removing every single minion biased rule on the kit. There are many. First, Q cheats. When you cast Q, it puts a buff on minions that say, if you are going to die to minion damage, don't. Which guarantees that Seraphine can last hit with her Q. This is not block tower shots, this is not block champion shots. It tells a minion, the minions all get a buff that says, if you're going to die to a minion, don't. That rule is going away. There are some champions who cheat their last hits. Kaisa Q is actually one of these as well. Many mage spells do not cheat to this degree. And ultimately saying that Seraphine is going to be a quote-unquote fair mage. Q is still a very high damage spell with a very large AoE, with a good AP ratio, with a very low cooldown. It is going to be relatively easy to still last hit with Q, but it is going to be much harder because it will no longer cheat for you. It is also losing the damage amp against all non-champions. This actually affects Dragon as well. We can add it back to monsters if we want to, but it's such a small part of her power budget that she can Q to kill the Dragon a bit faster when it gets low, that whatever, it's champion only now. The Q amp is better than it was before. The base damage is higher. The cooldown levels 1 through 4 is better as well. Whatever, so is the mana cost, whatever. Regardless, you no longer have a damage amp on your Q against minions. This thing still has 320 damage and a 1.0 AP ratio on every double cast. That is enough to one-shot casters from level 9 onwards, no problem. But the current version of Seraphine one-shots casters from champion level 5, which is so early that she becomes functionally unassailable in lane way too early. One thing I've seen people talk about is that there's a whole lot of... well, people are kind of talking about power curve overall, but ultimately, my belief is that Seraphine too quickly becomes a very free wave clear bot way too early into the game. This will make it much less likely to be true. E is also getting a 30% damage reduction against minions. This spell used to have a minion damage reduction way back in the first version of the kit. It used to scale down with rank, so I believe it was 60 to 100% damage to minions based on E rank. This is now a flat 70% damage to minions. This is here to, once again, go after her wave clear. I want to be clear, we are being really, really aggressive at attacking her wave clear to buy power budget for all the other things she got in her power budget for Seraphine. Now, if we end up going overboard and bot lane Seraphine sucks, we have very, very easy bot lane specific tweaks that will specifically give bot lane AP carry Seraphine power by making it easier to last hit minions. These are very easy levers to re-add, retune, and add in, but the current read is that we need all these to buy the budget that we need for the rest of the buffs to give support Seraphine the 2% win rate that she needs. The passive amp was also tripled against minions. This certainly mattered some, of course. It would help you get last hits once in a while. It now just does normal note damage. This lines up with other spells such as Lux passive, where it deals the normal damage but what you go for, and it is up to you to line up your attacks and line up your abilities and land your last hits. Seraphine has to last hit in quote-unquote fair ways. This obviously is a fair bit of QOL down. It's certainly a bit of cheating down. We're also lowering her base AD very substantially, once again going after her ability to last hit. This does give her one of the lower base ADs in the game, but again, she also has relatively inexpensive large AoE spells that are pretty good at knocking down minions who can't dodge your spells. So there are a lot of attacks to specifically her wave clear. Everything else we've kind of talked about in terms of what was tweaking, what was getting tweaked about the kit, but there are a bunch of minion biased rules that are getting nerfed. So let's go over an example kit here for what happens to the build that we expect to be the primary build for her secondary audience, which is bot lane Seraphine. What does QE AP Seraphine look like? Well, she has more PvP damage. Her Q is faster. Her Q has a functionally higher base damage and AP ratio via the execution damage tweaks. Her E after level 10 is just stronger at all points in time. It's going to be weaker in the very early landing phase. It'll have more base damage, but a longer cooldown and less CC profile. Your W is buffed until, I think you need like rank 3 for the cooldown to equal. Maybe it's rank 4 for the cooldown to equal. So your W is functionally always buffed. Bot lane AP carry Seraphine does not reach level 17. So nope, you're getting more damage. You're getting E pretty early on. By the time you're about 1 item in, your E is now better. Before 1 item, your E is now worse. Your W is just stronger, and last hitting is significantly harder via the reduction of a lot of rules that were biased toward last hitting as Seraphine. Now, does this champion end up losing about 1% win rate from current QE Seraphine, which is roughly the amount of power budget we want? Maybe. I mean, we'll see. If she ends up losing 5% win rate worth of last hitting power, she gains 1% win rate of W, and it's only 1% win rate of, Q and E damage, then we've overnerfed the champion, and we can add things back as needed. But as it stands right now, the current change list has this going on for primary mage QE max Seraphine. That's the video. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Bye-bye.